Welcome to the first lecture of Unit 4. This is the lecture on Antebellum Reform, 1820 to 1860. You'll notice that the dates for this overlap part of the dates for the last unit, and that is something worth paying attention to because historians will often divide periods of time up, explore the politics in the time, then explore the social developments in a time, but really you should think of them as overlapping. So this is lecture 10. Reforms have come and gone through American history in multiple time periods for lots of different reasons. And so historians have been generally interested in why reform happens. What makes people decide that they're not happy with the world the way it is and they want to fix it? They want to make it better. So for the 1820s, there are two sort of theories about why the reformers are reforming then, and one is democratization. We studied this under Andrew Jackson when we looked at how states were granting white men the right to vote regardless of owning property or not. And so as more and more people are participating in the public life of the world around them, they're kind of being given this hint that their views matter. Political parties are courting people. They're trying to get people to vote. And so people, they're being pursued, they're being wooed, and they think to themselves, gosh, I matter. What I think is important. And gee, wouldn't it be great if I got together with other people and talked about what I care about, and then we work to make the whole society just like we want it to be. Another theory that I think is really important is the market revolution. This one says that as the economic changes were happening in the 1820s and 30s, people were uncomfortable with them because changes were happening so fast that people were discomforted, that they were not sure of what the future was going to be. And so they look for solutions to help them cope with the new world order. They are adjusting to changes in their lives, and so reform helps them hold on to what they value as they're navigating a new world coming in the future. There's one key development that's underneath all of the reform movements, and it's a religious development. We call this the Second Great Awakening. So as the name second implies, this is the second time this happens. The First Great Awakening was 100 years before this. And where the Second Great Awakening is going to emphasize a lot more human agency and human freedom, that First Great Awakening kind of emphasized God and God's sovereignty over your life. So they have two different driving impulses. The Second Great Awakening also has two distinct phases. Phase one is a southern phase, meaning that between 1795 and about 1810, Southerners, particularly Methodists and Baptists, see a lot of people joining those two churches and thinking about their souls and the meaning of their lives. The second one is 1810 to 1835, and it's a more northern phase. So it's not Methodists and Baptists, it's more Congregationalists, former Puritans, and Presbyterians. When you look at the two revivals in terms of what they have in common, both Southern and Northern, there are a lot of similar features. Feature one is a very strong emphasis on people reaching for God's grace. Not waiting for God to rescue you, but instead you reaching out and saying, hey God, is it my time? Will you rescue me? I really want to be part of the church. So it gives you as a human being a lot more to do in terms of achieving grace and salvation in your life. Because this revival puts a lot of emphasis on people's power, the power of individuals, you get this sense that people can achieve perfection here on earth, that perfection is not something that you wait for in heaven, that it can happen here as well. Third feature is that religion is a matter of the heart, not the head. So these revivalists will talk about emotions and what you feel, what's in your heart, what's in your soul. They're not appealing necessarily to logic or reason or intellect. These revivalists also emphasize working together. They associate with each other. And there are a lot of associations of people coming together to try and address, the needs of society. Not just through churches, which are one way you can associate with other people, but reform associations as well. Finally, there is a fifth kind of fringe element in these revivalists, and that is a belief in what's known as millennialism. The idea that Jesus is coming back, and very soon. People at this time period are thinking that Jesus might return to earth within their lifetime, and that gives them a sense of urgency. We need to get this world cleaned up before God comes back, before Jesus comes back, and that we're ashamed of this pigsty of a planet that we live on. So they work together. They're got this sense of urgency and bringing the world to a perfection that has not been seen in quite some time. And this all can be done through human agency, through people taking the lead and making their lives better. This chart illustrates the explosive denominational growth between 1820 and 1860. We see an increasing amount of Christianity being injected into public life in America, even more than in the colonial and revolutionary periods. It's becoming that Christianity is almost the dominant religious language of American life at this time. You can see 1820, 2,700 Methodist churches, 19,000 by 1860, Baptists, a similar increase, but not quite as much. Presbyterians gain, Catholics gain, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, everybody gains in terms of church growth. People are building churches, they're starting to go to church more. Religion is becoming embedded in American public life in a way that it really wasn't in the generation before. Many of the preachers at this time were almost like rock stars in the way that they would hold their audiences captive with their speaking powers, with their physical movements, with their emotionality. These revivals were wild and crazy, ecstatic events where the preachers would have people in a frenzy, falling on the ground, crying out to God for mercy, jerking, twitching, searching for God's grace. Crowds of thousands of people gathered to hear preachers like Lorenzo Dow and Charles Grandison Finney. Many of the revivalists, listening to guys like this guy here preaching, were showmen in the sense that they knew how to bring out an emotional reaction in their churchgoers. That worked particularly well at this time for bringing a lot of women into the church. In fact, women converts outnumber male converts in great numbers at this time period. There's almost an association that Christianity and women are to go together, as if women are somehow more moral than men. Women are more tender-hearted and affectionate for God and Jesus than guys are. So you will see lots of women falling down, crying, screaming, yelling as, the preacher is emotionally manipulating them over the state of their souls. One of the places where the revivals particularly were strong was New York. Upstate New York in particular is showing on this map where you will see people like the Mormon church in the light blue dots, Millerites, which are purple dots. Millerites are people who were looking for the coming of Jesus in 1842 because their leader had, given them a specific date. Utopian groups in black who formed utopias, anti-slavery churches in red, the revivals themselves in green. And when you put all of this on the map and you note where these things are in relation to the Erie Canal, it is suggestive that sometimes the economic dislocation, economic growth, fast-paced economic change would drive people to religion. Because look, here's the canal. Look at all the dots. Things that are places that are closer to the canal, they get fewer and further between the further you get away. So one historian investigating this called it the burned over district, an area where the fire of revival fell so often that there were frequent reforms, frequent new churches, and even new religious groups springing up in New York. And let's look at one of those, the Mormons. The Mormons are America's largest homegrown religious group. As indicated by the previous slide, upstate New York is where they're formed. If you're a fan of the musical, it's Upstate. And the story of the Mormons does fall along those trends of economic dislocation and trauma from the market, because the founder, Joseph Smith, came from a poor family who constantly couldn't make it. Dad kept losing everything. The family was, hurting, not very successful economically. And as a kid, Joseph Smith was a treasure hunter, looking for buried gold and other kinds of, treasures in the earth. So it's not surprising when, this guy growing up in the burned over district in 1830 says that he found some golden plates, which were buried in a hill and contained a record of an earlier group of people in America who had been visited by Jesus. And their story is essentially then the Book of Mormon. Smith quickly attracted some people who were interested in religion and particularly interested in his ideas. He himself went to a lot of revivals as a kid and sort of had a hard time figuring out which revivalist was telling the truth. So why not have your own religion? In Ohio and Missouri and Illinois, Smith and his followers tried to create their own religious utopias, sort of a close-knit Mormon world where they could worship as they wanted. But every time they would be run out by locals because the Mormons were notorious for unethical activities such as printing their own money, their own Mormon bank money, and not being able to back up the value of it, so they were charged with fraud. In Illinois, they were creating their own Mormon militia group, and people were kind of worried, are they going to be attacked by the Mormons? But it kind of made sense because in Missouri, the governor had actually declared war on the Mormons. So they weren't a very well-liked people at all. In Nauvoo, Illinois in 1844, while Smith is in jail, he is actually killed. Um, and the group decides at that point that the next leader, Brigham Young, is going to have to take the Mormons to the West. It just seemed like Mormon polygamy, the closed-off utopian economy of the Mormons, and their desire for political power wasn't going to be welcome anywhere in the eastern United States. So Utah would have to be their new paradise, their new home. The Mormons aren't the only utopian group. About 100 utopias between 1776 and 1850. These utopias were all focused on creating the perfect, ideal society. Many of them were organized on the belief that the environment shapes your behavior. That the reason people are the way they are is because they're in bad environments. Bad environments make bad people. So you create a utopia and you create a perfect environment, you'll create perfect people. Some of the utopias are focused on spiritual equality, spiritual development, spiritual growth. Some are focused on economic equality, so making everybody roughly equal. These are sort of like early experiments in socialism. Some of them wanted to create the ideal social structure. They believed that relationships between people was the key problem that needed to be fixed. And so they had elaborate rules for people's behavior. Most of them did not survive. The rules were often disregarded at some point by somebody who got really tired of following them. People sometimes got tired of the leaders, and fights broke out between competing factions. Sometimes they couldn't make money, and so the utopia just couldn't survive. It couldn't feed itself or actually pay its bills. Some of the famous utopias in American history are the Shakers, a religious group that believed in celibacy, separating men and women so they wouldn't have dirty thoughts. Their founder believed that God was both male and female. They had elaborate rules for conduct, and they still exist. There's not many of them left. A little farm in Maine. Brook Farm, which was a utopia for writers, transcendentalist writers, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. Oneida. Oneida was an interesting utopia that believed in relationships between men and women being roughly open so that if you found somebody you liked, you could spend time with them, have a child with that person, but there would be no marriage there, no sense in which the man owned his wife. They were trying to create a better sort of world for women in doing so. So lots of people didn't understand Oneida. They talked about it as a system of open marriage, and that just seemed to be kind of crazy to them. New Harmony, an economic utopia with the goal of kind of ending class conflict and ending inequality in economic lives. Here's a map showing the utopias. You see most of them are in the north, and a great deal of all of the reforms that we're going to see are basically northern reforms, more so than any other kinds. Here is a Shaker village in Maine in 1845. The Shakers were very interested in the organization of space and had lots of ideas about spirituality being, influenced by how things are laid out in terms of the space you use. They had elaborate codes of conduct to make sure that people use the spaces appropriately. So, for example, there are rules about men and women passing each other on the stairs so that they don't get the wrong idea. The Shakers also believed in dancing. Apparently here they're performing the Thriller. Notice that men and women dance separately from each other. Notice there's even an African American male here in the dance. And as a result of dancing being a spiritual exercise that's important for them, we have a lot of Shaker musical tunes. This is probably one of the most famous that you've heard. 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. Other ones that you might have heard are, my life flows on, an endless song above earth's lamentation. And all of these would have been played as part of their elaborate spiritual dances. Here is John Humphrey Noyes, the founder of Oneida. Here's a picture of Oneida and the people together on the lawn. Another picture of Oneida. This is one of the most interesting utopias, but certainly not well liked, because Oneida and his followers didn't believe in like conventional marriages, and he taught his followers ways in order to enjoy the reproductive act without necessarily having children, and that just didn't sit well with local people. Eventually, Oneida became problematic because Noyes himself was overbearing, demanding. People kind of got disillusioned with him, and eventually the group broke up. But one of their profitable side businesses was making silverware, and today there's a pretty good chance that you have Oneida silverware in your house. This is Brook Farm. It was for writers who were looking to escape, into the beauty of nature and be inspired to write. It didn't work out because most of the writers were too lazy to do any of the work around the farm, because, you actually have to, muck the stalls and feed the chickens and slop the hogs, and they were thinking, I want to write. Why am I here to do farm work? And New Harmony, which you can see was a very almost kind of militaristically designed space. It was a regimented society that aimed to get rid of all the distinctions created by economic inequality. The most popular of the reform movements was not a utopia. It was actually based around drinking. Because one of the side effects of economic change in this time period is that more and more workers are unsupervised in the evenings, and they are spending their hard-earned cash consuming alcohol. On average, 5.2 gallons of hard liquor per year per person in 1830. And that's creating quite a bit of problems. When Timmy comes into work the next day and he can't really operate the machines because he's hungover. So in the 1820s, the temperance movement began with an emphasis first on lowering people's usage. That is, look, drinking's fine, just don't drink so much. And their primary means to do this was moral suasion. Basically, that is, in other words, nothing more than listen to me when I tell you that alcohol is not good for you, please stop drinking. That's moral suasion. Think of persuasion, just missing the per. So I convince you morally that what you're doing is wrong, and you voluntarily give up doing it. That emphasis on moral suasion only works to a certain extent. And many of the temperance reformers realized that they needed to provide alternate ways for people to get together and to spend time together so that they wouldn't have an excuse to go to the bar and get drunk. Out of this came the working class temperance movement known as the Washingtonians. They even had a female version, the Martha Washingtonians. And together, these groups tried to get working men together and working women together to not drink, spend time, be sociable, sing songs about how good water is for you. Literally, I'm not kidding when I say that. And then that would alleviate the temptation you might have to go out and drink, because drinking could be a social activity for many people, and still is. Politically, however, neither of those things really stopped people from drinking altogether. And so the crusaders against alcohol started looking towards political ways of shutting down liquor. And this is particularly among the Whig Party members who thought, can we use the law to curb drinking habits? Can we pass laws that will make it harder for people to drink? Democrats, believing in individual responsibility and personal freedom, did not want to use the law to regulate people's drinking habits. They felt like that was between you and God, your wife, and the bottle of liquor that you got. Both Maine and Massachusetts passed laws to limit access to alcohol. Many places created liquor licensing, and that way you could shut down places by just denying them a license. Some of these laws were designed to limit how much you could drink by requiring that you can only buy alcohol in 10 gallons at a time, which is kind of an impractical way of buying alcohol at all. The laws indicate overall this sense in which you can try to persuade people to behave and do the right thing, but there are always going to be some people who won't, and who will need something stronger to try to, curb their bad behavior. Some people are just bad. One problem with using the law to regulate drinking habits is the fact that some drinking is a cultural tradition, particularly among the Irish and the Germans. Which is not to say that all of the Irish and the Germans are drunkards. It's just that there's a strong tradition of beer and whiskey consumption that those two groups use because it's socially a part of their culture. It's been that way for a long time. And so Irish people go out in the evening, and yes, they might get drunk, but this is the world in which, they've been accustomed to living. So these laws, in many ways, go against some traditions that belong to certain groups of people. Here's a chart of the consumption of alcohol, measured in hard spirits, rum, whiskey, gin, brandy, per capita in U.S. gallons. And you can see the peak is 1830, 5.2 gallons a year. Overall, the temperance movement is successful. Look, it does drop. Drops pretty significantly to below 2 gallons a year. And then roughly since 1970, we've been creeping upwards. We're somewhere now right about 2.5 gallons of hard liquor consumption per person per year. with all the still health effects of that, right? It's dangerous. I mean, alcohol is essentially a poison, so your liver works really hard to get it out of your body. They're the side effects today of drinking and driving. Side effects they didn't have because they didn't have cars. So it's still a public health issue for Americans, but we're nowhere close to that 5.2 gallons a year back in 1830. Thank goodness. So the temperance movement does have songs, so you can remind yourself how bad alcohol is. I'll teach you one in class. Here's one I'm not going to teach you. It's a little bit harder to sing. King Alcohol has many forms by which he catches men. He is a beast of many horns, and ever thus has been. For there's rum and gin and beer, and wine and brandy of logwood hue, and hock and port and flip combine to make a man turn blue. He says he's merry, for here's good sherry, and Tom and Jerry, champagne and perry, and spirits of every hue. Or are these not a fiendish crew, as ever mortal knew? Minor, as you might guess, we in an E minor, because, alcohol hurts people. This is probably the most famous of the illustrations of the dangers of drinking. This is The Drunkard's Progress. A popular print that was blown up life-size so that you could walk into a hall and see it like human-sized. They charge you like 5-10 cents to walk through, and you'd see all these illustrations of the dangers of liquor. So it starts off very easily with a glass with a friend. Oh, not really a problem, right? Not going to hurt anybody. And then you take a little bit of liquor to keep the cold out. And then you have a glass too much, and then you can't stop. You're drunk and riotous, and then you're with your friends because, alcohol's always with your buddies. And you're a confirmed drunkard. Well, they pretty soon abandon you when you can't afford to buy rounds for everybody. So it's poverty and disease for you. You get fired from your job because you're drunk and you don't show up to work. Then you're forsaken. Then you turn to crime to get more liquor, and then you kill yourself. And who is left crying and weeping for the loss? It's your wife and child. This is perhaps my favorite. This is The Effects of Drunkenness. It was printed in a book. Many, many books about the dangers of alcohol. 10 Nights in a Bar Room is probably the most famous of them. This one shows what happens when Daddy comes home drunk. He takes little Timmy and he slams him against the fireplace. Oh no, little Timmy. So join the Washingtonians, get your certificate to certify that you're a member, and remember, when you take alcohol, you're being tempted by this red-dressed seductress, the snake, saying, just take a drink. Won't hurt you. Do you catch the biblical themes here? Instead, you should look to the woman in white, the pure, the chaste. That will lead you to be a good, healthy Christian man. Give your life to Jesus, not alcohol. At the same time, there are all these reform movements. There's a rising spirit in literature to create a national literature that is clearly American and celebrates American individuals in a way that's not been celebrated before. This nationalism has been gaining ground since the end of the War of 1812, when America's like, yes, we won. It rose under the Monroe Doctrine. It rises again with Andrew Jackson, this cult of the celebration of America. But the problem for Americans is, do they have any literature that's truly American? Do they have anything that's not just a fake, slavish imitation of European traditions? And for a while, the answer to that is no. Until the 1820s and 30s, when you start seeing writers writing things that are distinctly American themed, writers like Emerson, Cooper, Washington Irving, writers who are producing pieces of literature that are not just merely imitations of British literature or imitations of Greek and Roman classical literature. You even see American art, very pro-nationalist American art, such as the Hudson River School, painting American outdoor scenes, like this scene over here where these two guys are looking at the lush nature around them. This lush, beautiful American landscape is the glory of the United States. And rather than painting, European themes of battles and generals and people that are not American, let's paint the American landscape. The most well-known of these groups of American painters are known as the Hudson River School. They are guys in and around New York who paint. A lot of them do actually paint the Hudson River, but they paint other rivers as well. Out of this birth of national literature comes a new literary movement in America called the Transcendentalists. Now, as much as we would like to believe that the Transcendentalists are fully American, they're actually not. They're actually Romantics, which started roughly about 1789 in Europe. In America, these Transcendentalists pick up the Romantic themes, and some of them take them in different directions, as you'll discover when you take American literature. But a lot of what they talk about is nature, just like this scene of nature over here. About learning from nature's God, speaking to the trees, letting the winds and the waves, teach you about God's creation. You can learn beauty. You can learn truth from this natural world. You can learn deep spirituality by being connected with the natural world. And therefore, you don't need cities. Urban life is actually bad for you, according to the Transcendentalists. Now, as you'll discover next year in literature, not everybody buys this, but a lot of people are into the Transcendentalist movement. A lot of writers, Brook Farm, Utopias, full of them. And they do produce some of America's first classic expressions of literature in the Romantic style. A guy who comes to observe all of this and try to figure out what's uniquely American is a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville comes to the United States to study penology, that is, America's prison system. He's interested in the mid-1830s in how Americans deal with prisoners. And the American prison system is kind of emphasizing, particularly in northern prisons, harsh punishments to rehabilitate people into living in the real world. So he's trying to study that and figure out how Americans are saving people's souls in prison and then, releasing them back into society. And while he's here, he travels around a lot. And he becomes fascinated with American life. And he praises a lot of what he sees. Americans' democracy at work. He praises our sense of freedom here in the United States, equality. He's fascinated with America's associations, the way people just seem to join groups to fight for things that they believe in. How Americans seem to be a part of all these different clubs and meetings and organizations. So he writes a very classic study about democracy in America. The chances are very good that you'll read it in college. Between you and me and the wall, much of it is a giant pile of bunk because he only traveled in the North. He's kind of taken in by all this romance that he sees, and so he doesn't really get much interaction with slavery at all and some of the darker sides of American life. Speaking of institutions like prisons, which is what Tocqueville was here for, we've got a lot of institutional reform. Poverty is something that's gaining a lot of people's attention at this time. You see a lot more charity for the poor, but at the same time, there's this really terrible development, a horrific development, that says poverty is linked to poor character. So if you're poor, you've got some kind of moral failing. So much of the charity work was linked to also trying to convert you to Christianity and pump you full of morals, because immoral people are poor, rich people are clearly not immoral at all. And that is a horrific development because it's a totally intellectually flawed development that is still with us today. Poverty is not necessarily the result of poor character. You have poor character among all people in a society. So it's not just that, somebody has got bad morals and therefore they're going to be poor. Asylums is a development largely pushed by a single woman, Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix nursed her own mother through her mother's mental illness, and she became convinced that America was not treating its mentally ill very well. Because in most places in the United States, the mentally ill were actually just thrown into prison. There was no treatment for them apart from being in jail. And she felt really bad about that because she felt that certain people getting mistreated in jail for problems that they couldn't control was not the best way to address their illnesses. So she went around trying to get states to build separate asylums for the mentally ill. In prisons, the emphasis becomes on curing people. There aren't a whole lot of prisons and jails before the 1820s. Most of the time, if you go to jail, it's temporary. If it's something that, for debt, or it's not a particularly bad crime. And then eventually, either you'll be let go or you'll be killed. You'll be executed, which is a public event in this time period. People are all invited to watch you die. So these new prisons were thinking, well, can we fix people? Can we take what's wrong with them morally, clean them up, and then release them back out into society? Last but not least, certainly definitely not least, is the development for free public education by Horace Mann, this guy in this picture right up here. Horace Mann is a Massachusetts educational leader who wants schools for everybody because he believes that all children should be given an education because it would reduce tensions in social classes. The poor and the rich kids would mingle and they would learn how to live together in a Republican society. So this free public education would basically bring everybody up to a level of, competence, where then they would learn to live together in the real world. So we have free public education today largely because of Horace Mann. This did pose a problem, though, for Catholics who came to the United States hoping that they would have the freedom to practice their own religion, and yet in the schools established by Mann and others, the Bible and the religious traditions used there were Protestant, not Catholic. So many Catholics created their own separate schools. And that's why there are a lot of separate Catholic educational schools in the United States, particularly in the North. to provide Catholics a place to go where the religious nature of the school would be centered around Catholic teachings and not Protestant ones. So great was this tension that there's actually a Philadelphia Bible riot over education for Catholic children in this time period. And sometimes there's even violence where, for example, convents will be burned to the ground by people who don't like Catholics. Here is Auburn Prison, which was in New York, where prisoners were marched in lockstep. They were forbidden to speak, and they were basically trying to be rehabilitated with very strict punishments so that they would learn to act and be appropriate in society. This is the kind of thing that de Tocqueville was in America to study. Here is a school. This is the Eureka Schoolhouse in Springfield, Vermont. Many of the schools were one room, and you'd have many ages all in the same room at the same time. One teacher, usually a male, but later you'd start to see more females by the 20th century. And then finally, bodily reform. The reform movements also created a series of other interesting reforms. Some of them were medical, like going to hot springs and taking the water cure. Many of them were focused on diets. Many of them were focused on even speaking with the dead. There's some interest in communicating with the spirits. Bodily reform as a movement was focused on bodily control, because the belief was that you could focus on your soul, and that's good. But what if you can't control your physical body? Your physical body could lead you into sinful behavior. The best example of that is Sylvester Graham, who is the inventor of the graham cracker. In 1834, he releases a lecture on chastity to young men in which he denounces masturbation because he says that young men are being led astray by their bodies. As they are led astray by their bodies, they commit this heinous act that keeps them from having a full relationship with God, and that eventually it could lead to blindness and death. The picture here on the right is actually a pamphlet in French called The Fatal Consequences of Masturbation, 1844. So, un fièvre violente le consume et il languit. A slow fever consumes him. He languishes. His entire body is burning up. His body is becoming stiff because he has indulged his passion too often. He raves, he stiffens, and then he dies. And he's 17 years of age. So what does Sylvester do? He says, I will invent a food that will keep young boys from engaging in this terrible behavior. Because my belief is spicy things drive people to masturbate. And if I can create a cracker that's wholesome and nutritious but not spicy, it won't inflame their mind and inflame their passions. And therefore, we can save their souls. There is Sylvester Graham and the title page to his lecture to young men on chastity.